Welcome to Make Me Data Literate, the podcast that makes data intelligible from the Australian Data Science Education Institute. We're on a mission to make the whole world data literate. I'm your host, Dr. Linda McIver, and every week I'll interview someone with a wild and wonderful relationship to data. Let's see what we can find out. Hello, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Make Me Data Literate. It's such a joy to be able to interview my dear friend Laura Summers, who does amazing work in ethics and fairness around data science and AI. Welcome, Laura. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, Linda. It's so lovely to be here to have a chat and talk about all of my favorite topics with the excuse of recording it for a podcast. How wonderful.
That's awesome. Can you introduce yourself for us and tell us who you are and what you do?
Of course. So I am a designer and programmer, and I've been working in startups for a long time, and before that in digital agencies and that sort of thing. I work for a machine learning company at the moment, and I also work on the side on my own project, which is called D-Bias AI, and that's essentially a project, a company that I founded, which is hoping to come up with tools and resources to help developers think about the consequences of their algorithms, their machine learning projects, their automations, and maybe be a little bit more pragmatic about how they can build in fail safes and think more holistically about the project and its context. There's obviously a lot of like what that could be, and that's a very hand wavy summary of like the things that I'm interested in. I've also been running a reading group called Fair ML Melbourne, which is basically reading papers in the space of fairness and sort of the topic of AI ethics is a big broad one, but it's we often focus on multidisciplinary papers that are interested in like how the humanities or how the social sciences ask and answer these questions and like what we can learn from that and bring into computer science. Um, and yeah, it's just been a topic I've been interested in for a long time. I think it sort of evolved really naturally out of my work as a designer because a lot of design is thinking about human impacts and human consequences. So it's felt like a very natural evolution, I think, for me in my career. And I often I often meet people who are like, "Oh, I thought design and AI are like, polar opposites." And I just think that's totally wrong. Like it doesn't feel to me like the questions or the challenges being raised by AI, but being raised by AI are even particularly new or particularly different from the challenges we've always had in software engineering. It just, if anything, just a little bit more existential, a little bit more pointed because the impacts and the scale of them can be so big.
I love that connection between design and AI because I think, as you say, a lot of these problems are not new, but we have this tendency in the tech industry to feel like we're the first people facing a problem and the first people ever to try to tackle a thing and to completely ignore history and and research in any other area that might be applicable. So I'm
Mm.
always very excited to see people bring other disciplines into computer science because we get a little bit deep into our own navels, I think, and forget that there are whole areas of research that
I
that
just
only
think
talk about these things.
uh, for me, it's like we're all just Dories from Finding Nemo swimming around, forgetting like what happened 5 seconds ago. It's like, the like short term memory of the tech industry as a whole is like astonishingly short. So yes, we have to be a
Yeah.
little bit, perhaps a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit better rounded, and yeah, reach outside our discipline a little bit to think about human consequences.
Right. It's like how every couple of years we reinvent phrenology, but this time as a technology thing. Like we can tell things about people from the shape of their face. Think, oh, can you just have a look at what happened when that was done before? Didn't end well.
Yeah, or I can listen to your voice and tell you your gender. That's always a good one.
No.
I know. I'm sorry. I
Yes.
could see your hackles go up as I said it. Yeah, no, it's exactly right. I think, you know, I've been thinking about this a lot, partially because of conversations we've had and, my own learning journey to try and, like, get better in my thinking about what is gender and what are these, like, descriptors we use to define each other. And I think that, uh, it's actually interesting to observe the papers and the things that people are trying to do with data as a way of kind of assessing our civilizational maturity, right? It's like we're at this stage where people still like collectively think that gender is a thing, or it's sort of a,
Mm.
it's a like firm binary, for instance, and that there's nothing else and that there's no variation. And I think that this is like being, this is like this classic thing where the science goes forwards and like disproves these ideas, but then like the sort of collective wisdom, the collective understanding hasn't evolved yet. And we need to like push the collective understanding forward before we can like come up with better research questions or come up with better like applications of these tools. Like the tools themselves are not doing the dumb applications, we are. Right? Like it's our problem
Mhm.
and it's our
Yeah,
collective understanding and it's our collective wisdom that's sort of holding us back.
a collective lack of wisdom.
Yeah, well, I was trying to be kind about it, but yes.
You were taking the positive approach. I'm not
Mm,
feeling the negativity today. Um, so this is all a really, I think, enlightened approach to technology, and my guess is that in your formal education, that was not emphasized. Based on my formal education experience, I'm guessing, I could be wrong. Maybe you had the best degree ever.
uh,
What what did you have to learn to do
right.
this?
Great question. I didn't learn anything about anything I do in a university setting. So I guess like the short answer is everything. And the longer answer is I'm very lucky that I was been able to culture kind of the desire, the spark for lifelong learning, and I've been able to follow my nose and curate my own learning to an extent, and that's been great. And it's also been a great opportunity to like gather like-minded people around me and be like, hey, I'm reading these papers and I need to know what other people think about them. I'm having a lot of feelings. I don't think this is good. Someone else talk to me about this so that I can like actually validate whether my opinions are, you know, mean but correct or mean and invalid. Like this is an important distinction. um but yeah, I mean, look, I did an English degree in my bachelor's, and I did this thing of like the classic humanities degree, like learning how to learn, learning how to think. And I very much enjoyed my bachelor's degree, but I also knew I didn't want to be an English professor or to write like analysis papers of other people's writings for a living. So that was never going to be my career path. And I had no idea what I wanted to do for a long time. I mean, before that, I wanted to be a ballerina. So I was like one of those 20 somethings who was just completely lost and had no idea what the future would look like. And yeah, I kind of like found my way into tech by accident. Like I came out here after doing my degree. I had just had my appendix out because I had like an emergency appendectomy when I was traveling for a year, and I'd like eaten through all my savings. So I was like, someone please give me a job so that I can like, earn some cash and maybe go back. And I just like literally fell into tech. A friend of my dad's cousin's friend was running a product company doing like some accountancy software, and they brought me in for 2 weeks of QA. I'm using inverted bunny commas. 2 weeks of QA. I was there for 4 years. Narrator voice.
Oh, wow.
And like that was a very interesting introduction to tech for me. Like I wasn't a programmer or a designer at that time. I was just like forming some opinions about like what was possible and finding some interest points. So that was kind of what got me interested in like user interface design and interaction design. And partially it was because what we were doing was like just genuinely awful, to be totally blunt. Like it wasn't great and it was really
Mhm,
unintuitive. And this is back in 2003 when I joined the company. Like this is back when like user experience design wasn't really an established sort of phenomenon yet. So I think I was getting some intuitions that, the machine and the face of the machine were, fundamentally divided. There was something like really not working there. But I didn't have like the formalisms to speak to yet, and I didn't have like any training to know how to like describe that back to the company. So I tried and totally failed, I think, to like communicate those concerns back to the company. But I did like have a great time learning a lot of different skills. I did my first SQL queries in that company. I did some support, I did some QA, I did some design. So like I got to like, this is back in the days of desktop apps. Do you remember like those little standalone like app icons that you would put on your desktop?
Yeah.
I This is like these are the precursor to fave icons, and I got to design one of those. It's like the first and last I'll ever design, I think, and it was, but it was quite fun, and it taught me a lot about like, design principles for working on a computer screen as opposed to working on pen and paper. And while I was there, I went and did a multimedia degree because I was like, oh, I think this is like the right space for me, but I have to like, get the stamp of approval from an institution. But again, like that multimedia degree was pretty wrong in lots of ways. I didn't really learn the things I wanted to learn. But it did certainly give me some pointers for what I wanted to go learn next. So I'd say like to try and be kind to my master's degree. It wasn't that helpful, but at least it like helped me work out where to go after I finished. Like it did give me some pointers for like the areas of knowledge I wanted to explore and to like work out how to formalize my intuitions about design and interactions and interfaces. And certainly, like, there were a few things from that degree that really landed for me. And one thing I will never forget is I had a teacher of like design who used to say, like, interaction elements have to have interactive affordances. And he'd always say this, interactive elements have to have interactive affordances. And this is before the days of flat design. So he would have been completely horrified by like all these flat UIs where like you can't really see the difference between the text and the button and like the navigation elements. But I think that he had a really good strong intuition there, which is that like your design is supposed to help people understand what they can do. It's like a handle is hand shaped and it
Mm.
turns and it like has this kind of intuitive turningness to it. And I think that's like a good metaphor for like a good interaction design is you want the things that you can do to the machine to have some like intuitive like ergonomicness available to you as a user interface designer, or sorry, as the person using the interface rather.
That really resonates with me. I have a background in usability, and we rented a car last week in Perth that had something like 10 buttons that were identical shapes with tiny little, quite faint designs above them to show what they do for things like the fan and uh, um, whether the intake, whether you were getting air in from outside or not, the recirc. Like there were 10 different buttons, and you could not see, based on the shape of the button, what it did, and you had to stop and take your eyes off the road and look at the buttons in order to do anything, which in a car is like just dumb. And actually, those old style buttons that you turn work really well because you can feel the knob and you can feel the turn and you know what you're doing without looking at it. But they're not fancy enough, they're not high tech enough, so we have these buttons that are wildly unusable and the
Yeah,
affordances are just
terrible.
absent.
Yeah, I have a like hot take on this. I think haptic buttons are going to reappear in, and just for context, if your listeners are unfamiliar, haptic just means like things you can touch and feel. So like vibrations from your phone are buttons that are physically buttons in the world or knobs, as opposed to like the digital equivalent, the virtual keyboard, the virtual button. And I think they're going to reappear in like transportation devices and like sound devices and things that are like I don't know that they'll reappear on, say, phones, or at least not as more than a curiosity. Like we've seen like some flip phones come back and some like old school buttons come back, but I don't know if it's going to like really come back and take over the market entirely. But I suspect that we're going to see some kind of nostalgic retro design for really beautiful haptic buttons in cars, and it might even be like a high end phenomenon. And people are going to be paying more for like a really good, really like minimal digital interface combined with really beautiful haptic buttons.
I feel like we've thrown away a whole lot of information from
Mm,
our interfaces by making them all digital. We're losing that physical element, which can give us so much information at such low sort of processing cost. You don't have to think about it. You just, feel over there for the knob and turn it, and you don't have to stop and go, which button is it, and is it going the right way, and has it actually
yeah.
turned? Has it dialed up?
Yeah, not to mention like the challenges of, I mean, aside from, moving your eyes off the road down to the interface, there's also like all the challenges of light conditions and color contrast and all the things that will make that interface usable or not usable depending on the ambient conditions and depending on the like physical conditions of the user. So
Mm,
like there's all this stuff that's extra hard for interfaces that you just like don't have to worry about when it's like a button that has little clicks for notches. You go,
mm,
okay,
yeah.
yeah, I feel like the industrial designers of the '60s are rolling over in their graves going, "Why? Why I taught you so many things."
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's interesting that you can relate this usability of devices and interfaces to almost like the usability of data, because
Mm,
data is only useful for what we can do with it and how we can understand it and how we can analyze it. And in the process of presenting that to an audience, there are a lot of the same principles around the way people can interact with it and how they're going to get information, how they're going to extract information from it.
mm.
um so
Yeah,
um
I was thinking about exactly this before this call because I was like, "Oh, what do I wanna, like what do I wanna, chin wag with Linda about?" And I was thinking, something that I think about a lot is, data structures, which is like I am literally the nerd who likes to read API like docs because I like to understand how the data is structured. And it's kind of like scratching at this thing that I have been trying to name, and I think I've got a pitch for you. So you can tell me if this makes sense. There's something about the ergonomics of data, like how well shaped it is, how useful it is to purpose, how like, like can I like it's like does the door handle fit my hand? Does the like data structure fit my mind? That's the metaphor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense, because we know that in order to understand anything, you have to be able to connect it to existing structures in the mind. You have to be able to incorporate it to your existing understanding. And if you can't, that's cognitive dissonance, and you tend to throw away information which is cognitively dissonant. Just go, I can't make sense of that. I'm just going to ignore it.
Yeah.
So in order
And
for people to understand it, you have to have the right structure that fits with things they already know.
yeah, and like of course, the ergonomics is partially like how the data is structured or like what you decide to like record, but then part of it is also like how you're presenting it and the ergonomics of the visualization. So like something I've talked with a lot of people about, and I think there's been a lot of like agony spilled over is like confidence measures and confidence intervals because I think most people find them quite unintuitive and quite hard to interpret. And they're trying to like make available a very important intuition, but I think they're very hard to design. And this is like an actually like a really interesting kind of corner of data ergonomics, right? Is like what if you have interesting and important information about the data that you're trying to share or to make visible, but the way that you're doing it is like actively it's like net negative, it's like making it worse, it's making it harder for people to interpret. And like I think
And you
this is a hard question, right?
It absolutely is. Can you quickly explain for us what a confidence interval is?
Oh, right. Yeah. So when it's often used for machine learning models, and it's essentially like an attempt to show like the margin of confidence or like the degree to which the machine thinks that its prediction is like likely to land actually on the prediction or like somewhere near it. So you might say like I think that for the next 10 people to coming to my auto shop, I think they're going to buy red cars. But like that's a prediction, it's definitely not reality. And then there might be some variance around red, and it might be mauve, and it might be purple, and maybe there's some outliers which are blue. So like the confidence interval is an attempt to visualize like how far away from that actual predicted class or predicted number, the machine thinks like reality might fall. So it's saying like, this is my prediction, but then there's this kind of like fuzzy area around it where I think it is, completely within the bounds of reality that this could happen as well. And these infinite intervals can be very tight around the prediction or they can be very loose. So this is about like how confident in general the machine is. Like the tighter the confidence interval, the stronger the strength of the prediction itself, like the actual predicted class. And the wider the interval, the more the machine is trying to tell you, um, but this is like something you can talk about, very hard to communicate visually.
Yeah, yeah, it really is, and I love the work of Mona Chalabi, who does her um, data displays by hand, precisely to convey that this is not, um, that the data is flawed and complicated, and it's not, because people are more likely to understand that a hand-drawn sketch is not a perfect representation than they are a graph that is straight out of Tableau or
Yeah.
some really fancy digital graphing package. And I think that's a really important message to get across. We tend to forget that models are educated guesses, really, and hopefully they're very educated and really quite good guesses, but
Mhm.
that confidence interval tells us how good we actually think they are, and that's hard to remember, especially with things like climate change and COVID, and even weather predictions, where we want to know, I need to know, is it going to rain today? Like that's all. I don't care about your model. I don't care about your how accurate you think it is. I just want to know, do I need to take a raincoat? Or is it going to be crazy windy? Do I need to tie down the things? Like, just I want some confidence, and especially with these existential threats like COVID and climate change, I want to know what's happening tomorrow, and I want to know what's happening next year. And we just don't have that information. And that's
Mm.
quite hard to wrap our heads around.
Mm. You just got me thinking about like this whole design domain of like vector graphics versus raster graphics. And just to like give that a little context, like vectors are like shapes that you see that are smooth and there's no like pixelization. So they're often geometric shapes, and they're like these smooth, elegant, like glossy looking graphics, like the ones you described that come out of Tableau or that would come out of like a
Mm,
graphing library in R or in Python. Whereas like you have raster graphics, and rasters are like, more like photographs of the world. They often have what's called compression artifacts in them. So you kind of lose some quality, you lose some detail as it gets compressed over time. And I think that's actually like a better way to think about data and data visualization is like it's a lossy process. It's like something where you're losing fidelity and you're losing data um, as it goes through the process. And in fact, I have some. I've been like trying to mull over how I can communicate this easily to people who don't do programming or aren't like thinking about data and code all the time. And like I have like these two aphorisms that I've been trying to shape up that are like a conceptual pair. So like the first one is that like programming is just opinions we bake into code. And the second one is data is just the questions we ask and which answers we write down. And I think
that's great.
and these things are both good because they make you understand that it's a lossy process, right? Like you're
Yeah.
going from the real world, like the real like territory. This is like a map territory problem, right? We're going from the real world with like all of its nuance and all of its detail. And then we're sort of losing a lot of that as we go through the process to try and encode something or to try and like capture something. And that process may or may not be successful or functional or good, right? It's a human attempt, it's very subjective and it's very lossy. And I think that like if we can help people reframe what they think of these things as, and like kind of build their intuition about the objectivity or subjectivity of them, that will you know naturally improve how we interpret data, or how we interpret like data visualizations, or how we engage with these things, because we'll go, oh, well, you know, this is just someone's attempt to communicate something they think they've learned by trying to capture some data in the world. But like, there's several steps in that process, and at any of those steps, things can fall down. So, like, if I want to really engage with it, maybe I'll look at their research design first, and then I'll look at the data they've captured, and then I'll look at the visualizations they've put up. And like, that will be a much more mature and much more nuanced way of engaging with that work than just like looking at the graph and being like, oh yeah, obviously the GDP of UK is better than that of Somalia or whatever. Like, it's like these things are engaging with them at this very like shallow level is almost better than not engaging. Like, it's almost worse than engaging with them at all. It's like
Yeah.
we're just like inviting ourselves to make these like cognitive leaps that aren't justified.
Yeah. Yeah, my cousin shared with me a graph this morning that was comparing COVID deaths in India versus Australia, and it was from the media, and it was like COVID deaths are so much worse in India, but they were raw numbers. Like, hang on a minute, can we look at the population of India versus the population of Australia? And if you do the numbers per head of population, they're actually
Mm,
almost identical, and it's a
mm.
completely different story. And like, you don't even need statistics in order to understand that that's a mistake. You just need to think about it for a minute and go, hang on, you can't compare those two. That makes no sense. So I think that's a really important point. This has been an awesome conversation. I have completely lost sight of my questions. Um, what is there one thing that you wish everyone knew about data that you think would just completely change things? If everyone got this one point, we'd be good.
I mean, I think data is like, I think, we've used this metaphor a lot, that data is oil, or data is like a
Mm,
raw material. And I think that's completely wrong. I would rather think of data as like the artifact of a conversation, and think of the conversation as a good conversation or a bad conversation. But that's like the thing to measure, is like, was the conversation good? Was it useful? Did you ask good questions? Did you, like, follow up the interesting threads that presented themselves? So I think if we could stop thinking of data as like monolithic and the
mm,
same, and
yeah,
think of it more like human conversations, which have huge variance in quality, that
yeah.
would help everybody a ton.
That's a really important insight. I like that. It's like it's not it's not a given that data is uh pure in its raw form. We forget that. We forget that a lot.
I mean, I have a good example of data collected like, uh, you know, in haste, which was absolutely terrible quality, and it wasn't the fault of the data collector. It was the fault of the system. At one startup I worked at, I was in a hospital startup where we were working on a communication app, like a task app for hospital clinicians, so nurses and doctors and orderlies, that sort of thing. And as part of that work, at one point, I was trying to do some interviews with clinicians and shadow them, and I shadowed a night nurse, and she had a job which was like, it was like, I don't even know how to describe this without calling it like really pejorative words, because it boggled my mind. But it was like, she was looking after a ward which is called the ambulatory ward. So it means that it was people who could walk. They were mostly people who had had like, like elective surgeries or broken their leg or something. But they weren't people who were like in critical need of care. And but she was like, as the like head of this ambulatory ward overnight, she was technically supposed to fill out this clinical observations form on every patient, one per patient per hour, for the course of the night. So if you call that, like 10 to 6 or whatever, that's like however many, I think like 8 or 10, she was supposed to produce per patient per night. And it was an 8-page document, and it had a whole bunch of questions that required like measuring things. So, like putting on a blood pressure cuff on someone,
Yeah.
or like taking their temperature, or doing, like there was sort of the standard like visual observations, but all these other things. And I was like, when I was watching her do it, I was like, you can't actually do that, right? She's like, yeah, no one can do this. Like, it's not physically possible to do this many clinical observations per patient per night, but we have to do it. So we just pretend like we're doing it. So like that's a great example of data that like absolutely cannot be high quality, like by its nature, by the nature of the collection time frame, that cannot be real data, right? Like, it's not possible for her to like stand by every patient's bedside and do this 8-page document, one per patient per hour across the course of the night. It's not physically possible for one person to do it. But there's this kind of collective insanity where we agree that like for the purposes of like risk aversion theater, for like the purposes of some kind of like
Oh,
performative agreement, that we decide that this is like better than doing what we actually physically can do, which is maybe one per patient per night or a couple per patient per night. Um, so yeah, I think like, that's just to like your earlier point, like that's a great example of like data that like, the structuring could be great, but the conversation is rushed, right? The conversation is done like in a major hurry. You're like, "Da, da, 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 da,"
yeah,
like filling out the answers, and you can't possibly like really have gathered any important information or nuance from that, because and I think from memory she did many of them at the end of the night shift as well. And I'm not trying to get anyone in trouble here, because like this was not the problem of this nurse. This was the problem of like
no,
the
the
system
system.
whose like approach to risk aversion was to like add more layers of bureaucracy without any consideration to whether it was possible to complete those layers of bureaucracy in the time allotted. um, and
Once
that
again, like this is a situation where you don't need to understand stats and you don't need to understand even medicine or nursing to know that this is dumb. Like,
right, right.
I just, the audience can't see me, but my head is in my hands. I'm like, what? What are we
I
doing?
know.
Ah,
But, like, you could
would
imagine,
you?
like, you take your 3-year-old to, like, follow you at work, and she'd be like, "What are you
Mm,
doing, mommy?" You'd be like, "Oh, I'm filling
mm,
out the forms." But you could try and explain to your 3-year-old that you have to do it to make your bosses happy, but you couldn't explain what the value of it was. Like, you couldn't explain
mm.
to her, like, what's gonna be like, these are just documents that are gonna go into an archive somewhere in case there's a legal challenge. Like, that's literally the
Yeah,
purpose, is to be some kind of, litigatory, like, fail-safe or, like, fallback. But this is not how anyone would describe good medicine or good care, right?
yeah, that's foul.
Mm.
That okay. I need to move on from that, or I'm gonna start
Okay.
flipping
No,
tables.
that's fair. That's fair. We'll put the
Oh
night nurse
man.
back in her night nurse box, and, like, like, thank her for what she taught us and move on our way.
Yeah, I think so. So the next question on my list, I don't know whether that answered it, maybe it didn't. Is what are the worst data mistakes that you've seen? Like that sounds like a really bad one, but
Uh, I mean, look, I had a couple of examples of I struggle to call anything the worst, because I think there are many of the things I've seen are bad in different ways. Like there's
Mm,
things where it's like deliberate choices that the startup made, that were made like with the best of intentions, but like for bad reasons.
yeah.
Uh so like um, I worked in a fintech startup, and when I first joined, they had this like risk assessment tool, and the risk assessment tool was like intended to like understand how much your risk appetite was for like investing in the stock market. So like how sort of resilient would you be to like losses in your portfolio? Do you understand the risk you're adopting? And like this is a pretty standard thing for any kind of investment tool. Like you try and establish this and like make it clear to the person that investing in the stock market is not like linear progress up. It's like up and down and up and down. This is actually like a really great application of data visualization and data storytelling, right? Is like trying to help people like really internalize what's going on and understand what their journey might look like, as opposed to just like telling them just don't look, and don't like come back in 20 years and just don't look, which is like how a lot of supers deal with this, because
Yeah.
and they don't have like the sort of same requirements to explain because they're super, and you have to put the money in somewhere.
Mm.
But yeah, they had this like hard coded rule in there. So this is like, this is based on data. They had like done some work looking at how different demographics like tended to invest, and they had observed like this is a fairly commonly known thing in general, that like women tend to be a bit more financially um, a bit more financially like risk averse and a little bit more conservative. So like less willing to make big purchases and less willing to take on big risks. Um, like we can litigate the question of what is a woman a little later. I can see that on your face, Linda. We can absolutely like have that other conversation in a minute. But just to like engage with the like question as it was presented, they decided, because they'd observed this, and as I said, like it was a fairly common truism around like financial circles that like women were a bit more financially conservative. They had written a piece of hard coded logic that prevented women from receiving the highest risk portfolio. Now,
Oh,
I know,
oh,
I know,
oh.
and like we talked about it with them, and they did change it. But the point is that like this was done genuinely with good intentions, not like with a desire to um, worsen existing inequality, but a desire to like, I would say like perhaps to be more realistic, it was more of a paternalistic desire to protect women from the worst outcomes. And I think that like I can understand the thinking that got them there, but it's also very frustrating that they didn't have any other like, humanities or like, intersectional feminism like knowledge to call upon to be like, actually, by preventing women from taking on the highest risk, they're also preventing them from getting the highest returns. There's an existing like financial gap for women where like women tend to have less income, less savings over the course of their lives. Maybe it's contingent on us to not worsen an existing financial inequality that exists. And like they just hadn't gone through that journey in their minds, like they just hadn't had that discussion for themselves. um
But even without the all of that context, they've made the mistake of going on average, therefore every. So, like on average,
yeah,
women are more conservative, therefore every woman is more conservative. On average, they're more risk averse, therefore they're all. And it doesn't work that way. Like averages
yeah.
are, a very blunt instrument, and
Well, this
we
is
can use the same argument for on average women are or aren't interested in things, yes, but that's completely irrelevant when you look at one specific person,
yeah.
because that person does not represent the average, because that's not the way it works.
Well, like if you wanted to, like averages are like, as you say, they're blunt instruments. Like one of my favorite sort of truisms is like, the average person has one testicle and one breast, and I think
Yeah.
that's, it's like, of course, like you can't like, and I talked to them about it, and I was like, how would you feel if you had done this quiz and then like had been dropped down a category without your knowledge?
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, and they thought about it, and it's like, unfortunately often we have to like internalize unfairness and ethical impacts by like considering how it would feel if we were the person, or consider how it would feel if it was like someone that we were protective of, like our child, our mom, like great auntie Gert, who's
Yeah.
like not great with tech but still sharp as a tack. Like there's,
Mhm.
it's, once you kind of humanize the problem and make it like real to ourselves, to our families, to our context, then like you can see the penny drop and see people go like, oh yeah, I can see why that would feel bad. And in fact, like this is like a bit of a 60 minutes like expose waiting to happen if we were to get caught on it.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe like that speaks to like a broader philosophy I have about tech, which is that any desire to like obscure the machine, to draw the curtain across the face of the machine, is a bad instinct. It's a bad impulse. Like your job as interaction designer, as an interactive, like, as a person, is to like invite people in to what the mechanisms are, to make them explicit, to make them transparent, and to make people better consumers of, the tool, the data, the experience as they use your tool more. Like that's your only job, is to make it clear and to like make it possible to like dig down to the whys more and more. So like maybe you can't show all the detail in your dashboard, but if someone wants to understand how you arrived at a number, your job is to
Yeah.
make that visible to them. And
Yeah.
the desire to like avoid those questions or obscure them, I think is like somewhere between laziness and paternalism. And I hate both of those. So I'm like very,
And it's a big red flag. It's
yeah,
a big red flag.
exactly.
So those are the kind of, I want to say innocent, maybe the word is more naive, um, data mistakes. Have you seen data deliberately misused, and how do we spot it? How do we
Uh,
identify when that's going on?
I probably won't like give too much detail because I don't want to get myself or other people in trouble, but um I think that like if you are doing any kind of research, whether it's qualitative research or quantitative research, and like the person paying for the research says something along the lines of like, I want you to discover X, or we're going to,
Oh,
like this is going, like it's not even like a statement. It's like there is an implication that you're going to validate their opinion. That's
yeah,
always what it's about. Is like
yeah,
I need to do this research in order to like be proven right, or for my opinion or my feature idea to be the thing that's chosen. And I
yeah,
think like that's a very like common and very problematic place to start research from. Um,
yeah,
and like I would actually prefer, and it's been often my recommendation, that if we don't have the appetite to really do the research, and by really do the research I mean be willing to do a different thing if the research says this is the different thing we should do, then we just
yeah,
shouldn't do it, right? Like if we don't have
yeah,
the appetite to change our minds or try a different tack or like produce two competing features and see which one performs better, then just do the thing you wanted to do already and then reassess it if it's not performing, right? Like,
yeah,
but if you just want to be validated, it's a really bad framework from which to do research, and it kind of poisons all future research efforts as well because like it sort of comes from this place of ego and self-validation. Um, and I say this as someone who's like done this and made this mistake before as well. Like I've had strong opinions about what will work or what won't work going into some research and had to like really like, eat humble pie and go, "Oh shit. I thought that was so obvious, but I've watched 3 people try and do this now, and I can
yeah,
see that the design I was very attached to like clearly does not work."
yeah.
Um and like, I don't know how we detect it, but I can say that a strong antidote for it is to involve everybody in the research. So, like, get your director to watch a research session, get your developers to come in and participate. Like, research should not be siloed or like invisible to the other people in the team. And if you are doing it and you have like put some effort into giving it some rigor, then you should try and like invite everyone to come in and eat humble pie with you, right? Like it's incredibly hard, but also incredibly informative.
So again, it's about not drawing the curtain. It's about having everything open and transparent and questionable. And I think I
Mm.
guess that's one of the things you look for, isn't it? Can I see all of the all of the raw data? Can I see the processes? The way the research was conducted, is it open and transparent, or is it like, just take my word for it, this is what we found?
Yeah. I mean, this is a major problem in machine learning papers, and part of this is like a real physical constraint that the amount of data used to train these models is so big it is hard to share. But
Mm,
also, there is like a common problem where people will say, like, in theory, you can see my data, but then when you ask to see their data, somehow like it's a
yeah,
problem or you can't.
yeah.
And this is kind of a common recurring theme I see in the AI fairness world is like there's often like I mean we have greenwashing, we have like feminism washing, we have like all sorts of washing, and now we have fairness washing. We have people wanting the gloss of like having done the hard yakka, to do the Aussie expression, um, but then like when it comes to like like giving proof or like making it actually available for inspection, they get a bit shy, or it's too hard basket, or you'll
Yeah.
get like some data but it'll only be like a small chunk of it, or it'll be like the wrong version of the data. Like this is actually an anti-pattern that I'm very sensitive to. Like if you say that your data is open and available, but then you're only willing to give me like a version from 3 years ago, like I think you're actively misleading people, and that does
Mm.
feel like something that needs to have repercussions to me.
Yes. Yeah, it's it's one thing to say you're open, it's another thing to actually be open, and that's come up a few times just in the course of this podcast. Um,
Yeah.
what is the first question you ask when you look at graphs in the media?
When I look at graphs in the media, um who paid for this?
Yep.
Usually. Like, is it Murdoch? Is it someone else? What are like,
Yeah.
or like the long version of that is like, what is the story they want me to understand? Like, what is it that they want me to take away from this? And do I agree that the data proves that story, or that the data like
Yeah.
tells that story? Um, I mean, there's a kind of sensible answers, which is like, do my axes make sense?
Mm,
Are the units consistent? Have they labeled them? Like, can I see the volume? Is it like
mm,
10K or a million? Like, is that even visible? That sort of stuff.
mm,
But yeah, I think like um and to be honest, this like who paid for it, it's the same for any kind of tech. It's not even just graphs. It's like
yeah.
when I inspect something and my spidey sense goes off and I think, something's going on here, like I usually go down the rabbit hole of who paid for this, and then
Yeah.
that's as informative or more informative than any other form of like inspecting the code, or trying to understand what's going on.
Yep. I think that's incredibly important. What excites you about data?
um I think data, when it's the artifact of a good conversation, can be incredibly illuminating, and it can tell us stories that we didn't already know. It can help us like reframe our idea of ourselves and how we fit in the world. I think like there's been so much hype about data in the past 10 years, maybe even 15, and so I tend to be a little bit cynical, a little bit allergic to the hyperbolic statements, but I do really believe that there's an enormous amount of explanatory power in data if it's been well structured and well conceived. And I also think that, many of us, in fact, I would argue most of us, um, can understand a concept so much better and with so much more richness and nuance when it's like text accompanied with like visual. Like it's, like the graph or the data visualization plus the text. It's like those two
Mm,
things together, like illuminate all parts of our brains, where just the text doesn't and the graph on its own doesn't. So I think that like, it's an important part of storytelling, of us communicating the things we're learning about the world and the things we're trying to measure in the world, and the things that we need to tell each other. Um, and I also think, like, to be totally blunt about it, it's beautiful. Like I'm an aesthetic person. Like I started as a designer. I find like beautiful aesthetics attract me. And some of the things that I am most attracted by at the moment are people doing really beautiful, really like, quirky or really huge data visualizations. I find these things so intriguing. Like they sort of set your mind down a bunch of different pathways it might not have taken already. Um, I have a graphic on my desktop all the time, which is a codex of cognitive bias, and it's like one of those like circular. Sorry, Mike. It's one of those circular line graphs, and it's just this huge sort of visualization of all the ways that our minds can lead us astray. But I find it like sort of it's nice as like a graph and as like a metagraph. It's like these things that we're attracted to are like, also like the things that lead us astray. So I sort of think it's like this
yeah.
interesting piece of data work, because it kind of invites us to think about you know a layer of abstraction above it's like, here's like a list of different kinds of cognitive biases presented in a really beautiful way, and also like step away from it and think about, what is it about this graphic that attracts me, and what is this about the way that we think and the way that we consume data, and does this like teach me something about myself in like the interacting with it. And I think that's like, it's like good art. Good art will do that too. Like it makes you better understand yourself and the world at the same time.
That's beautiful. I love that.
I will have
Thank
to
you
send
so
it to
much.
you. I will send you
Yeah.
the beautiful codex.
We'll have to find it online so we can link to it so that we
Mm,
can put it in the program notes.
will do.
Thank you so much. This has been such a joy, and so many different and fascinating angles on data and interfaces. And yeah, it's just been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Linda. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Make Me Data Literate. You can support the work of the Australian Data Science Education Institute at givenow.com.au/ADSEI. Tune in next time for more conversations with amazing data experts.